Well, we are now recording, and you're Dr. Alan Mendoza at the Henry Jackson Society. And Dr. Mendoza, we want to talk about the effects of Brexit on Eastern Europe. What does it mean for that region that is a former satellite of made up of former satellites of the Soviet Union? How would Brexit be received there?
Well, I think it depends on which part of Eastern Europe. First, it's a mistake to assume that it is a monolithic bloc. Of course, in general terms, this is the part of Europe that joined later than, of course, Western Europe, as circumstances wouldn't allow it. And EU membership was seen for those countries at the time as a way of normalising their status internationally, but also as a path to prosperity. And indeed, that's largely followed. The countries involved are much more prosperous than what they were before joining, and in general terms, I think membership is highly thought of. That said, there have certainly been cases with, particularly if you look at Hungary, Poland, where the Brexit opportunity is causing or providing calls for a realignment within Europe itself. These countries are very anti-immigration. Hungary, as you know, is already having a migrant quota referendum of its own, so is looking to take advantage of what will happen as a result of Brexit. And in general terms, there is a call and a feeling amongst Central Eastern European countries that things need to change within the European Union, and the British exit provides an impetus for that.
In Hungary, for example, what are the implications now then that the EU is losing one of its top members, one of its main benefactors? What has been the reaction there, as far as you can tell?
Well, we've seen the Prime Minister Orban has already stated he will see this an opportunity to realign Europe to a vision that he's more happy with. He has secured the support of the Czech Republic, of Slovakia and Poland for sort of discussions on this, and he would very much like to see free movement ended, if you like, within the European Union, or at least the migration part, so that there is control over people coming in, and the European Union cannot enforce migrants coming into those countries. That's where the main focus of attention is. Although there are suggestions some of those countries may even leave Europe, I would suspect that would be a strong step at this stage. It may happen down the line if others leave, because once again the prosperity argument has been very helpful for them over the last decade and a bit.
The Hungarian government tends toward Putinism. So how does Brexit play into its relationship with the EU?
Well, of course, it's already been down that path, even without the previous situation that's now upon us. The Hungarians have ploughed their own furrow, even within the European Union, for some time, and indeed have made manoeuvres domestically, as you say, to affect the Putinization of Hungary's domestic politics. That trend is only likely to continue. It's not going to change because of what's happened. Again, they may seek to take advantage of this and to increase, if you like, the domestic balance in favour of strong government. Now, of course, this then plays out into foreign policy terms as well. There's no doubt that Britain was one of the, is one of the toughest European countries when it comes to facing down Russia and Mr. Putin. Of course, Britain isn't leaving the European Union just yet. It's still going to be around for some time, although we don't quite know how that relationship will work. But there may be a move within some countries of Europe to try and cut deals with Mr. Putin, particularly if he offers preferential terms, as a way of hastening a change within the EU, both domestically and with foreign policy there.
I was going to ask you, what can the Hungarian government find with Putin that it is not getting at the EU?
Well, it very much depends on financial terms that are being offered. Of course, the Russians are in not a good financial place at the moment, given the collapse in oil prices. And even though those are rebounding slightly, they don't have the money to lavish that they did a few years ago. That said, the Hungarians might see this as an opportunity to gain some influence in other parts of Europe, particularly further to the east, and to possibly lead a movement within Eastern European countries, and therefore give themselves some, if you like, diplomatic leverage in a way they haven't had for many years either. So there's a potential for financial gain and also diplomatic prominence. And of course, Mr. Orban is very keen on embellishing himself on the world stage. He'd very much like to be a bigger figure than what he is, and standing with Putin gives him that opportunity.
Very recently, in the Washington Post, we saw Boris Titov, the Kremlin small business ombudsman. Actually, this was, it was in a Facebook post. He says, it seems that it has happened. The UK is out. In my opinion, the most important long-term consequence of all this is that the exit will take Europe away from the Anglo-Saxons, meaning the USA. It's not the independence of Britain from Europe, but the independence of Europe from the USA. What do you make of that?
Well, there's certainly some truth in the fact that without the UK, Europe is going to be less liberal and indeed less sort of economically liberal in that way. You'll probably see a protectionist turn of some kind that will develop. That will change the internal dynamics of the EU and how it manifests itself. And yes, of course, given Britain's historic role as the bridge, the Atlantic bridge, if you like, between Europe and the USA, that's no longer going to take place within the European Union. Doesn't mean there won't be exchanges of various kinds still going on around the outskirts of the European Union, but within it itself, the transatlantic relationship is undoubtedly going to be weakened because the most transatlantic member will no longer be part of the European Union.
Turning now to Poland, we talked about Hungary, but how will Brexit affect Poland and its view of the EU?
Well, as we've already discussed, the Poles have given some support to the Hungarian position, at least sort of officially, and because of the recent change in government in Poland, that is, of course, like to a government that is more like the Orban model than what you had before. It is likely that similar moves within Poland will take place, demanding those changes in the European Union and a different relationship for Poland within it. And I don't think this will be isolated just to Poland, to Hungary. I think this will be a number of other countries demanding change, and of course we still face a prospect of Western European countries leaving the European Union as well, if they're allowed to have referendums. I think the truth is the whole political state of Europe is in flux. It's all up for grabs, and you will see opportunists like the Hungarians, maybe like the Poles, taking advantage of this to try and extract concessions or reforge things to what they would like to see happen now in Europe as a whole.
What about nations in the region that are trying to get into the EU? And I'll take Serbia as an example. Once they meet economic and political reforms, that's their membership's pretty much hinging on that. The UK has been seen as sort of the mean teacher trying to push the reforms the hardest. With the British now out, does that mean the Serbs, or do you see them backsliding on these reforms, or just giving up on the idea of the EU altogether?
Well, I didn't give up on the idea of the EU as long as the EU actually exists. Let's not forget again, the reason people, Eastern European countries, Southeastern Europeans have wanted to join the EU is for prosperity purposes and much anything else. It's access to the single market, it's part of the reform process that helps make those countries more competitive in the region and indeed in the global economic market. So you won't end up having those countries not wishing to be part of the EU. The question, of course, is whether the criteria will be enforced rigidly now by countries which may be desperate in the EU to bring in new members to show the project is still a success. That is a dangerous move, because if you end up with countries coming in to the EU who don't meet the criteria, who aren't able to be on the same level as some of their EU counterparts, that will exacerbate divides in the European Union and probably hasten its decline as well.
Okay, and last question. I'm sorry, I'm hopscotching around here, but I want to ask you about Poland, and what are Russia's concerns there?
Well, there are long-standing concerns that Poland have about Russia's interest in the region. With Poland being a near neighbour, with Poland having the kind of historical fear of the Soviet Union, to remind, and indeed further behind than that, you have obviously a sense that an expansionist Russia, a Russia that has pushed into Ukraine, that is making threatening noises in other parts of the world, may yet continue with such a policy, which could involve conflict in some kind with Poland. I don't think anyone's expecting Russian tanks to sweep through into Poland anytime soon, but I suspect the Poles will have one eye towards a resurgent and aggressive Russia on a weak Europe's borders that may act to pressurize countries close to them, just as in the days of the Cold War, Finland was pressurized by the Soviet Union without having to be part of the Soviet Empire as such. I suspect for the Poles it's a question of influence, and indeed whether they will be able to repel a strong and resurgent Russia should Mr. Putin again resort to foreign adventureering.
We see the rise of nationalist movements in Poland as well as in other countries in the region and, in fact, across Europe. In Poland, do you see a Russian hand in any of this, of the rise of the far right?
That, to be honest, that's a question I don't know enough about in terms of the specific situation in Poland. We do know in general terms Mr. Putin seemingly has been very happy with the rise of far-right nationalism across Europe. We know the ties, for example, with the Front National, how that works in France. We've seen other examples. I think it's safe to say that Mr. Putin favours discord among European countries. He's not above manufacturing lies about fascism, as he did in Ukraine, claiming that the Ukrainian national movement was fascist and racist in its path, and of course it serves a purpose to make him appear a moderate and benign force in the world. So obviously we have to be quite careful about that eventuality.
Okay. Dr. Mendoza, I want to thank you very, very much for your time today. We really appreciate your